I decided to focus my project on photo manipulation and editing using Adobe Photoshop. I've always been interested in photography but never had used this software to edit my images, so I was pretty excited to start learning this program. Photoshop is a photo editing software that allows users to retouch and manipulate your projects in virtually any way you can imagine. It can be pretty intimidating of a program for beginners like myself, as there are so many different built-in and third-party tools to learn. It's basically impossible to fully master this program with everything that it has to offer. Photoshop is also used for creating image compositions, website mockups, and adding effects. In the professional world, it is a necessary tool for designers, web developers, graphic artists, photographers, and other creative professionals. There are a few variants to Photoshop that are designed for different users. The Photoshop Creative Cloud (CC) version is considered the professional level software that is designed for advanced users. Photoshop Elements, on the other hand, is more of a consumer level version that still contains a lot of the professional capabilities that are in Photoshop CC, but is more simplistic in design in order to avoid overwhelming the users. This particular version was made for amateur photographers and hobbyists. The last one is Photoshop Lightroom. This version was intended for batch processing large volumes of images and does not contain many of the operative functions and features that are in the other versions. If you learn the basis of these functions, you will have a good idea of how to use Photoshop. Global and local adjustments, the toolbox, layers, opacity, adjustment layers, layer masks, and filters are a good amount of the features you will consistently use. They are a lot to learn on their own, but are essential to mastering Photoshop. For the sake of time, I'll only go over a few of what these features are and what they do. Starting with global and local adjustments, this determines what parts of the image you are editing. Global adjustments are changes that are made to the entire image. So for example, if you were to change your brightness, you would go to the top menu, click Adjustments and Brightness Contrast, and that would change the entire picture's brightness level. Local adjustments are changes made only to a specific area of the image. One way to do this is to use the brush tool and brush over selected areas. There are many tools you can use and way too many to cover in a short period of time, so I'll just glance over a couple of them. There are 6 tool groups: Move and Selection, Crop and Slice, Measurement, Navigation, Retouching, Painting, and Drawing Type. The Hand tool is a largely used navigation tool that allows you to click and drag an image around the screen. A retouching tool that I really like to use is the clone stamp as well as the spot healing feature. The clone stamp tool takes pixels from one area of the image and paints them over pixels in another area. The spot healing tool removes blemishes and other minor problem areas from your image. The last basic feature is layers. These are very important in the editing process. They allow you to remove individual edits without altering others you have already made. So you have destructive and non-destructive approaches to editing. Destructive editing would be to use the eraser tool to remove part of the image, for example. After saving your project and coming back to it, you wouldn't be able to bring back the lost pixels unless you had saved multiple copies of the project without that particular edit. Non-destructive editing would be to use layers and put individual edits on separate layers so that the base layer, the original image, remains untouched. It's much easier to make changes this way. My project comprised of 4 images where I manipulated components of separate images together to blend the 1960s civil rights movement with Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 that's continuing today. I focused a lot on the signage used in both movements to show the differences and similarities from then versus now. Let's open up Photoshop and take a quick look at how I edited one of these photos. This particular photo was relatively simplistic in the edits I decided to attempt. Here we have the original photo as my background layer. This layer stays untouched in case I decide to go back and alter edits I have already made. My goal was to simply take signs I had seen from images that were produced during some of the protests from the Black Lives Matter movement and integrate them with signs seen in the civil rights movement. In the next layer I created, I placed a cutout of a sign from another image using the lasso tool and placed it over top of the older sign. I used the eraser tool to cut further into the sign to remove the excess pieces of background that I couldn't get with the lasso tool, and used the smudge tool to blur out the edges so that it would blend in better with the original picture. In my next 4 layers, I altered the brightness, exposure, vibrance, and saturation of this particular sign because the image I got this from was too high of a resolution to blend in with the background. My last 2 layers were the final signs I added, where I used the same practices as before to further blend them in. And there is my final image. I hope you were able to learn a little bit about Adobe Photoshop and maybe decide to further explore all that this amazing software has to offer. Thank you for listening.